I'm live and I'm reading out of Winged Pharaoh. It's a novel, a book, a far memory book by Joan Grant. This was published in 1937 and Joan used to write books about her far memories. This is the first one. It plays in ancient Egypt before the time of the flood and Babylon. We are now in part 2 of this book, chapter 1, and it's entitled Ney-Sey-Ra. When Natty was 3 years old, he ran away. That's her lion. For many days no one could find him, and I thought I should never see him again. But on the 12th day he came back, followed by a young wild lioness. He led her straight to the lion court, and although she was shy of people, she followed him to his stall, and he growled and roared at any lion that tried to come near him. At first Zep was the only person whom she would allow to approach her, but even when she got used to people, she was never allowed to roam about alone. The royal lions were usually descended from generations that had been the companions of human beings, and it was very seldom that a wild lion was tamed unless it was brought in as a tiny cub. I caught Natty's mate, Sima. Just before she was expecting cubs, she disappeared. Natty was very unhappy without her. He refused to eat and he moaned and whimpered to himself all night. Zep told me that he thought Natty might find Sima, for he would pick up her scent, on which he dared not put the hound dogs, lest they frighten her. So Zep went out at night, when a lion can follow a scent easier than in the hot sun. He would take no one with him, for he said that Sima would know his voice and follow it, while from anyone else she would run away further. I got up very early the next morning and went down to the lion court to see if Zep had returned, but he was still away. I walked northwards to where, beyond the cultivation, there were hills of sand by the edge of the marsh. I had been walking for about an hour along the path where I had often taken Natty for his walk, when suddenly I saw him galloping towards me. He took my kilt in his teeth and pulled it as though he wanted me to follow him. Round his neck was a strip of linen, and I saw it was marked with red. I untied it and spread it on the ground. At first I thought the mark was just a wavy line made by a finger dipped in blood, but then I saw it was the drawing of a snake, and on its head were 2 strokes. This meant it was a horned viper, and I knew that Zep had been bitten by a snake and had sent Natty to bring help. I was nearer to the temple than the palace, so I ran there very fast, and Natty followed me. I found Zeta just leaving the courtyard. He sent at once for 3 litters, each with 2 swift runners. He said that would be the quickest way to reach Zep, because he could not be far away, as some of the blood on the strip of linen had not yet dried hard. Zeta took with him a box of salves and a smoo, a little animal that is quicker than a snake and plays with him just as a cat plays with a mouse, which is why they call it a snake cat. When Zeta was ready, I let go of Natty's collar and he ran on ahead, sometimes looking back to make sure that we were following. The runners were swift, and in less than an hour we had left the cultivation and were among the waves of sand on the north border of the marsh, where there are vast stretches of high reeds. We found Zep lying on the edge of them. At first I thought he was dead, but when Natty, who had run ahead of us, started licking him, he stirred. Ned had been bitten in the left ankle and had lashed the wound deeply with his knife. It had bled a lot, but not enough, for his leg was swollen and turning black. Zeta told me to try and make him drink some cane spirit. While I was doing this, he took the smau and made a small cut in its leg, letting his blood drip into a little cup, which didn't seem to hurt, for it licked his hand while he was doing it. Zeta told one of the litter runners to bind its leg, and then he made 2 little slits in Zep's flesh, one above the wound the snake had made, and one on the left breast, just above the heart. On these he bound 2 small pads of linen dipped in the blood of the smau. The rest of it he poured into Zep's mouth, who now had strength enough to swallow. Next Zeta took an evil-smelling ointment from a jar which he smeared on the snake bite. Then, after wrapping Zep in woolen cloaks, they lifted him onto one of the litters and set off to the palace. I called Ney-Sey, but he would not obey. He went back towards the reeds as if he wanted me to follow him. When he saw I wasn't going to, he came back and took my hand very gently between his teeth and tried to lead me along, so I went with him. And in the clearing, on a bed of dry sand, I saw Simma, with 2 little cubs. She curled her lips as though to snarl at me, but Ney-Sey rumbled at her, and then she let me stroke her. Her 2 little cubs were even smaller than Ney-Sey was when he had first slept on my bed. I took off Ney-Sey's collar to see, so he would know that he no longer owned allegiance to me, and was free to come back to the palace or stay with Simma. When I left him, he followed me to the edge of the reeds and stood watching me as I went away, before he trotted back to his own family. The runners of my litter caught up with Zeb before he reached the palace. He was put in one of the rooms near to where Zerta worked. For all in the palace who were ill, Zerta would try to heal with knife or herb. Ptah came and looked at Zeb, and he said he would better not tell for another day if he would live. His lips were a better colour, but he was still quiet and cold and did not answer when I spoke to him. So I left him and I walked through the gardens, feeling very sad, for I loved my faithful servant and grieved to think that he might die, and Ney-Sey had left me for a better companion. I decided to go to the temple and pray for Zeb. So I picked some lilies, striped white and scarlet, to take with me, and I sent for my litter. There was no one in the temple forecourt, for the sun was high and it was the time when people rested in the shade. I went to the sanctuary of Ptah and put my flowers on the white steps of his statue. Standing before him with my hands upstretched, I thought, though I said no word aloud, I called so hard to Ptah to hear me, that on his throne of stars he must have heard my voice. I told him about the snake and asked him from his bounty of life to give some more to Zeb, and to let him stay with me. Then I knelt and touched his foot with my forehead, for love of him and in humility. As I left the cool shade of the sanctuary, the sunlight in the outer court seemed solid as a golden wall. A young priest was walking across the courtyard. I knew by his robe he was a high priest of Anubis. I had seen him in the temple before, and he had heard that he had passed his initiation very young, when only 23. His name was Ney-Sey-Ra. He came and talked to me. He spoke as if he had known me for a long time, and I felt I was talking to a friend, though one much wiser than myself. He seemed to know that I had no food that day, for without my saying anything, he took me into one of the private gardens and brought me some honey cakes and figs and a cup of wine, which he said would make me feel less tired. As I ate, I talked to him, and although it was for the first time, it was as though we continued a conversation that we had started the day before. I told him about Zeb and Ney-Sey and Simma's cubs, and he said that I had been wise to let Ney-Sey free, because an unwilling captive could never be a friend. But he thought Ney-Sey would return to me when the cubs were older, for he had changed his habits to my will, because I understood his heart. I asked Ney-Sey-Ra about the snake cat and why Zerta had put his blood on Zeb, and he told me, some men think that snake cats take but little harm from the poison, even of a cobra, and that they have a special virtue in their blood which takes the evil from the venom. Zerta is trying to discover if a little of this blood mingled with that one who has bitten impart some of its own quality to the poisoned one, so that he can overcome the poison in his vein. And I told him of the ointment, and he said it was made of the fat of whatever sort of snake had given the bite, and he himself thought that both that and the blood of the snake cat were of little value. Then I said that I must go back to the palace and find out how Zeb was. Ney-Sey-Ra smiled and said, I can find that out for you without moving from the bench. And he picked up the silver bowl in which I had rinsed my fingers, and held it between his hands just where a shaft of light pierced through the canopy of vines beneath which we were sitting. Then, as though he were looking through a window into a room and describing what he saw, he said, Zap is asleep. Ptah has filled his body with new life. He will awake an hour after sunset, and then he should be given milk and wine. Then he will sleep again, and when he wakes tomorrow, all will know that he will live. In 20 days he will be well again, and have put a little scar upon his leg. I had never seen this power of looking used before, yet it did not seem strange to me. Without speaking, Ney-Sey-Ra got up and plucked a lotus growing in the pool, and then he said, "Do you remember?" And I remembered that I had dreamt of this the night before, and in my dream he had shown me an open lotus, like the one he now held in his hand, and he had told me that just as a lotus opens its petals until its golden heart reflects the brilliance of the sun, so must I open the gateway of my memory until, on earth, I could reflect the light. Then, in my dream, he had pointed to a half-opened bud, which, though it showed its blue petals, still had them folded round its heart, and this, he had told me, was a symbol of what I was now. The memory of my dream had come back to me in less time than it takes a bird to move its wing, and I went and plucked a lotus that showed its blue and said, "This is what I am," and pointing to the flower that he held, "That is what I long to be." And then he smiled and said, "I'm a high priest and you shall be a queen. But what is more pleasing to my heart is that I can teach you all you wish to know. Much have I taught your spirit while you have slept. Soon I shall also teach you here on earth." Before I left him, he told me that henceforth I should say this prayer before I slept. "Master of thy wisdom, teach me to be a flame for the benighted ones, so that I may warm their hearts and light their darkness, until of their own knowledge they can kindle their own fire, and having kindled it, can leave the darkness and dwell at last in the light of the sun." On the 20th day, Sep could walk again, and 3 months later Nati returned to me. Sima and her cubs followed him as he led them to the lion court gate and into his special stall, which had been kept ready for him, and my father allowed him to go with me wherever I liked, as he did when he was a cub. End of chapter 1 of part 2 of Winged Pharaoh. Have a lovely Thursday.